In the mid-1970s, inside a packed concert hall heavy with cigarette smoke and the rustle of glossy programs, something happened that stunned thousands. The lights blazed, the crowd roared, and Elvis Presley, the king himself, was in full command of the stage. Then, without warning, he stopped. His band fell silent. 20,000 voices cut off mid-cheer. For a heartbeat, no one understood. And in that suspended moment, a chill ran through the arena. What could make the biggest performer in the world halt the spectacle? Whispers rippled through the audience. People craned their necks, searching for an answer. Within seconds, the thunderous hall was so quiet, you could hear a cough echo from the balcony. Then something unfolded that would leave not a single dry eye in the room. To understand why Elvis Presley broke the rhythm of a show at the height of his fame, you have to go back, beyond the glittering jumpsuit, beyond the sold-out tickets, into the sterile corridors of a hospital room. There lay a 7-year-old boy, frail and fading, his doctors admitting there was little time left. His one and only wish was simple, impossibly simple, to see Elvis sing in person before the end. What followed was a chain of decisions, battles behind the curtain, and one unforgettable night that became legend, even among those who never cared for rock and roll. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. A pale winter sun slanted through the tall hospital windows, spilling cold light across the linoleum floor. The room smelled of antiseptic and faintly of rubber gloves, the kind of sterile odor that clung to every breath. Machines hummed quietly in the corner, their steady rhythm the only reminder that life was still present inside the boy who lay against the raised hospital bed. His name was Ronnie Twilley, just 7 years old, but already his thin frame looked as if it had carried decades of weight. His cheeks were hollow, his skin stretched delicate and waxy, and every rise of his chest seemed to demand more strength than he had left to give. Beside him, his mother sat on the edge of the narrow chair, staring out the window as though the horizon might carry some message she had been waiting for. Her face was worn with sleepless nights. The lines deepened not by years, but by grief. Every so often she dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief, careful not to make a sound, as though silence itself was a fragile curtain keeping her from breaking. She knew what the doctors had told her. There was no more treatment to try. Medicine in the early 1970s did not hold miracles for children like Ronnie. The words, "There's nothing we can do," had already been spoken, and yet she still sat and prayed for something, anything, that might ease her boy's final journey. Ronnie, despite his exhaustion, clutched one hope as if it were oxygen. More than toys, more than trips he would never take, more than the possibility of another birthday cake. What he wanted most was to see Elvis Presley. Not just on a record, not only through the glowing box of the television, but in person. To hear that voice fill the air and know it was meant for him. Every night, when the pain allowed him to stay awake, Ronnie whispered to his mother that dream. Sometimes he hummed along to "Love Me Tender" under his breath, the sound faint and fragile, but always with a spark that lit his tired eyes. The nurses, who tiptoed in and out of the room, learned quickly that if they wanted him to smile, all they had to do was mention Elvis. One evening, after the boy had finally drifted into shallow sleep, Ronnie's mother took a sheet of paper from the drawer of the bedside table. Her hand shook as she gripped the pen. She wasn't a woman given to writing letters, certainly not to stars who lived beyond reach, but desperation makes people brave. In slow, halting sentences, she poured her heart onto the page. How her son was fading, how his only wish was to meet Elvis, how she knew it was impossible but could not forgive herself if she did not at least try. She folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, and addressed it not to Graceland, but to the Elvis Presley fan club office she had read about in a magazine. She posted it without telling Ronnie. She did not want to burden him with hope that might never arrive. Days passed. The hospital routine was merciless. The morning rounds, the same whispered conversations in the hallway, the same smiles the nurses forced onto their faces before stepping inside. Ronnie's body grew weaker, his hands trembling when he tried to hold his cup of water. Yet his voice, when he asked, "Do you think Elvis knows me?" carried a stubbornness that broke his mother's heart. That letter, like so many sent by desperate families, should have been lost in the tide of fan mail. It should have been sorted into a stack marked "too personal," or simply discarded by secretaries who never dared bother the king with stories of pain. And, in fact, when it first reached the desk of Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's calculating manager, that was exactly what almost happened. Parker was a man concerned with schedules, ticket sales, and keeping the show machine polished. Emotional appeals only complicated matters. "We can't have every sick child backstage," he muttered, brushing the letter aside. But fate, in its quiet way, interfered. One of the musicians traveling with Elvis, someone who had lived enough hard years to recognize the truth in a plea, picked up the discarded envelope. Reading it, he felt a chill settle in his chest. Later that evening, he carried it into Elvis's dressing room. "Boss," he said gently, "I think you need to see this." Elvis, dressed in rehearsal clothes and running a comb through his dark hair, frowned at the interruption. He took the letter, expecting another request for autographs or charity donations. Yet, as his eyes moved line by line, his expression changed. He stopped combing. He read it again, slower, his lips pressed tight. Finally, he set the paper down on the table and leaned back in his chair, silent for a long while. When he spoke, his voice was low but certain. "We're bringing that boy to the show." The room shifted. The musician nodded, relieved, but he knew what storm would follow. Colonel Parker would resist, the bodyguards would bristle, the promoters would warn of chaos. But Elvis's gaze was unwavering. His career had been built on more than sequins and microphones. He remembered too clearly his own childhood in Tupelo. The hunger, the longing, the way a single kindness could pierce the darkest days. In the antiseptic silence of that hospital room, Ronnie still lay fighting for breath, unaware that a star in a white jumpsuit had just declared war against indifference. For the first time in weeks, an invisible thread of hope was pulling toward him. It was fragile, like the boy's heartbeat, but real. And in that tension, between despair and the faintest chance of wonder, the story began to take on a life larger than anyone could have imagined. The days leading up to the concert unfolded with a tension that felt like a string pulled too tight. Ronnie's family had received a phone call that seemed unreal. They were asked to come to Memphis, where Elvis would perform in just a few nights. At first, they thought it was some cruel mistake, but the hospital staff confirmed the arrangements. Elvis Presley himself had ordered seats for them, as close to the stage as could be managed. Ronnie's mother could hardly believe it. She packed his small bag with trembling hands. Extra clothes, medications, a photograph of their family at Christmas, and the inhaler that had become as essential as breath itself. She knew this journey could be too much for his fragile body. Still, she could not deny him. "We'll get you there, baby," she whispered, brushing back his hair as machines clicked steadily beside his bed. At Graceland and in the rehearsal halls, however, another kind of storm brewed. Colonel Parker had little patience for what he dismissed as sentimentality. "The boy's sick," he said sharply to Elvis. "Bringing him into a crowd of thousands is dangerous. He could collapse right in front of everyone. Think what that'll do to the show." Elvis leaned against the edge of the piano, arms folded across his chest, his jaw tight. "Colonel," he answered slowly, "the show isn't the only thing that matters here." His eyes carried that rare fire, stubborn, unshakable. He wasn't making a request. He was declaring a decision. Security men muttered among themselves, uneasy at the thought of ushering a frail child into an arena pulsing with feverish fans. They imagined the chaos if word spread. Desperate families trying to push their way inside, hoping for miracles of their own. But Elvis's word had a weight they could not ignore. For all of Parker's power, there were times when even he knew not to cross the man on stage. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the family confronted their own battle. The doctor, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, warned them bluntly, "Traveling in his condition is risky. He might not survive the journey." The words hung in the sterile air like smoke. Ronnie's father turned away, his fists pressed to his temples, torn between fear and the boy's plea. Ronnie, lying on the bed with the oxygen mask covering half his face, simply said, through muffled breath, "Please, I have to go." That was enough. Against every caution, the family prepared to leave. The morning of the trip was gray, the sky heavy with clouds, as if mirroring their dread. They didn't own a new car, just an old sedan that coughed to life reluctantly, its paint dulled by years of hard use. They placed Ronnie gently in the back seat, a blanket around his shoulders, an oxygen tank strapped beside him. Every bump in the road jolted through his small body. His mother sat pressed against him, holding the mask in place when his hands grew too weak. At one point, his breathing grew shallow, and panic filled the car. His father pulled to the side of the highway, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, while his mother whispered urgently into Ronnie's ear, "Stay with me, sweetheart. Just stay with me." Minutes stretched like hours, until finally his chest rose again, slow but steady. The car continued, creeping toward Memphis as if pulled by a force stronger than fear. Back at the arena, Elvis paced in his dressing room, a phone clutched tightly to his ear. The family had called ahead to say they were on their way, but progress was slow. Elvis listened to every word, his face tense. At last, he cut off the stage manager who was reminding him of the strict start time. "I don't care if there are 20,000 people out there," he said firmly. "I'll wait until they arrive. Not a note gets sung before that boy's in his seat." The manager stared at him, stunned. Delaying a concert of this magnitude was unheard of. But Elvis's decision was unmovable, and those around him recognized it. He was not only preparing for another performance, he was preparing to fight for something human, something that mattered more than schedules and contracts. On the road, sirens briefly wailed behind them. For a stretch, an ambulance followed, its lights flashing, until Ronnie's father waved it ahead. Ronnie's breathing rattled, his skin pale as candle wax. Yet every so often he opened his eyes and whispered, "We're close, aren't we?" His mother kissed his forehead, too choked to answer, afraid to let hope spill from her lips in case it shattered. When at last the family reached the edge of Memphis, the lights of the city glimmered against the night sky. The arena loomed like a great beast, its walls already vibrating with the hum of thousands of fans inside. Posters of Elvis in his white jumpsuit plastered the entrance, and long lines stretched around the block. The Twillies did not enter through the crowd, but through a side door, guided by staff who had been told to expect them. Still, whispers rippled among the crew. "That's the boy. Elvis is waiting for him. Inside, the family was ushered to the special seats Elvis had insisted upon, right at the front, close enough to see every bead of sweat on his brow, every glimmer of light on his suit. Ronnie was carried carefully, oxygen mask still in place, his blanket tucked tight. His eyes widened as he looked around the vast hall. For the first time in months, he smiled, frail but alive with wonder. Behind the curtain, Elvis heard the commotion of their arrival. The relief that washed over him was almost physical. He closed his eyes, whispered a quiet prayer, then turned to his band. "Now we can start," he said. The stagehands moved quickly, and the first chords were ready to thunder through the speakers. Outside, the crowd, restless from the delay, erupted the moment the lights dimmed. They had no idea what had caused the wait, no clue of the fragile child who had been carried in beneath the roar of their anticipation. For Elvis, though, the show that night would not begin with the crowd. It would begin with the small figure sitting near the stage, clinging to breath, clinging to life, and waiting for a dream to unfold. The arena pulsed with restless energy, a sea of sequined jackets, velvet dresses, and hand-painted signs held high by fans who had waited hours for this moment. The buzz of voices collided with the smell of cigarette smoke and perfume, blending into the charged atmosphere of expectation. The lights finally dimmed, and the opening chords from the band sent a ripple through the crowd like an electric shock. Elvis strode onto the stage in a gleaming white jumpsuit, the rhinestones catching the spotlight as though he carried stars stitched into his very skin. The roar that greeted him was deafening, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to swallow the building whole. He raised the microphone, offered his familiar crooked smile, and began to sing. From the first note, the hall shook with applause. Women shrieked, men clapped until their palms stung, and flashbulbs popped like tiny bursts of lightning. Yet Elvis's eyes weren't on the crowd. Again and again, as he sang through the opening numbers, his gaze slid to the front row, where a thin boy lay propped up in a chair, an oxygen mask pressed to his face, his mother's arm curled protectively around him. Elvis felt the world narrowing. The audience blurred. The glitter and noise dissolved. What remained sharp and unshakable was that fragile figure sitting so close he could almost reach out and touch him. With each verse, Elvis measured his timing, waiting for the right moment. Halfway through a song, Ronnie's eyes caught his. It was not a stare of awe, not even of disbelief. It was a gaze filled with something deeper, a silent recognition between a child fighting for each breath and a man who had carried the weight of loneliness despite standing in front of millions. In that instant, Elvis stopped. The music faltered. His band looked up in confusion, their instruments hanging in mid-note. The crowd, caught off guard, hushed in a wave that spread from the front to the rafters. 20,000 voices dropped into silence like a curtain falling. Elvis lowered the microphone and stepped toward the edge of the stage. He looked directly at Ronnie, his voice carrying without theatrics, clear and unshakable. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we've got a real hero in the house. His name is Ronnie Twilly." Gasps rippled through the hall. People turned their heads, trying to see the boy in the front row. Ronnie blinked behind the mask, his tiny frame swallowed by the chair, but when Elvis spoke his name, a faint glow spread across his face. Without hesitation, Elvis handed the microphone back to the stand and motioned for the music to stop completely. The arena was still. He descended the small steps at the edge of the stage, the spotlight following him as he walked toward the boy. Fans in the nearby seats craned their necks, whispering in disbelief. Kneeling beside Ronnie, Elvis took the microphone again and spoke softly, though the entire hall could hear. "This song isn't for the crowd. It's for you, buddy." The band, still stunned, waited for his cue. Then, with a nod, Elvis began to sing. His voice stripped of performance, bare and tender. The familiar melody filled the arena, but for once it did not belong to the thousands of fans. It belonged to one child, sitting in the front row, fighting to smile through the plastic of his oxygen mask. At first, the crowd sat bewildered. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The king of rock and roll halting his own show to serenade a single boy. Murmurs swept the audience, but slowly, as the rawness of Elvis's voice spread, the whispers dissolved. The arena held its breath. By the time he reached the chorus, people began to rise to their feet. First a handful, then entire sections stood, clapping softly, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. The sound swelled, not cheering, not screaming, but the deep, resonant applause of those who understood they were witnessing something far greater than entertainment. Elvis leaned closer to Ronnie, singing each word as though it were a vow. The boy's eyes glistened, his lips forming the shape of the lyrics, though no sound emerged. For a moment, the sickness, the machines, the hospital walls, all of it fell away. There was only the music and the connection between two souls who needed it desperately. As the song ended, Elvis removed the blue scarf from around his neck, damp with sweat, and gently placed it in Ronnie's lap. The boy touched it with trembling fingers, his mother sobbing quietly beside him. Without warning, Elvis slipped one of his rings from his hand, a piece of jewelry fans would fight over for years, and slid it into the boy's palm. The crowd erupted, but Elvis didn't raise a hand for silence, nor did he bask in the moment. Instead, he squeezed Ronnie's hand, whispered something only the child could hear, and slowly returned to the stage. The band, still shaken, hesitated before striking up the next song. Elvis turned back toward the boy, gave him a nod, and only then faced the crowd. His voice, when he began again, carried a depth that hadn't been there before. Every note that followed bore the imprint of that intimate moment, echoing in the hearts of everyone present. For the rest of the night, the audience no longer saw just a performer. They saw a man who had laid aside the spectacle to honor a fragile life. And though the show resumed, the memory of that pause, the silence, the song, the gift, lingered heavier than the loudest chorus. In a career of unforgettable nights, this one etched itself into history not because of the music alone, but because Elvis Presley had stopped time for a child. And 20,000 people who came for a concert left knowing they had witnessed a truth far greater than fame. When the last notes of the concert faded, the crowd filed out buzzing with a kind of reverence, whispering not about the closing song or the glitter of rhinestones, but about the moment when Elvis had stopped everything for a boy. In the parking lots outside, people spoke in hushed voices, as though raising them might shatter what they had just seen. "Did you see the way he knelt down?" one woman asked her husband, clutching the souvenir program against her chest. Another said softly, "I've been to 5 of his shows, but I'll never forget tonight." The next morning, the newspapers echoed those voices. Headlines spilled across front pages. "The King stopped for a child. Elvis brings concert to a halt for young fan." Photographs captured the instant when Elvis's hand rested on Ronnie's shoulder, the boy's fragile face barely visible beneath the mask, his eyes alight with something greater than illness. Journalists, usually content to chronicle set lists and crowd sizes, now wrote about tenderness, humanity, and an unguarded side of the superstar. But behind closed doors, not everyone shared that admiration. Colonel Tom Parker slammed a stack of clippings onto his desk, his face red with fury. "This is not the business we're in," he barked to anyone within earshot. "People come for a show, not for sob stories." For Parker, image was currency, and sentiment, no matter how authentic, threatened to disrupt the carefully maintained machine of Elvis's career. Elvis, however, was unmoved. In the quiet of his dressing room after the concert, he had sat for nearly an hour, his jumpsuit draped across the chair, a simple black shirt clinging to his shoulders. He hadn't touched the food tray brought in, nor responded to the soft knocks at the door. Instead, he stared at the floor, replaying the sound of Ronnie's breath through the mask, the way the boy's lips had shaped the words of the song. When the Twilley family was ushered backstage, Elvis rose immediately, his eyes softening in a way few had ever seen. Ronnie, weak from the night's exertion, was carried in his father's arms, the scarf still clutched against his chest. His mother, eyes swollen from crying, reached for Elvis's hand. "You gave him more than we ever thought possible," she whispered. Elvis pulled her into a gentle embrace and answered quietly, "No, ma'am. He gave me something." Leaning down, Elvis pressed his forehead lightly to Ronnie's. "I'll sing for you every night, buddy," he murmured. "Doesn't matter where I am. You'll be there with me." For a boy whose world had been reduced to hospital walls and measured breaths, those words were not just comfort, but a promise larger than life. In the days that followed, the Twilleys returned to the hospital. Doctors marveled at the change. Though Ronnie's condition remained grave, he seemed energized in ways they could not explain. He asked to listen to Elvis records as soon as he woke, sometimes tapping his fingers weakly in rhythm. His laughter, thin but real, echoed down the corridor, catching the nurses by surprise. "It's like the concert gave him another lease on life," one said, shaking her head in disbelief. Then came the letter. Written in his mother's careful script, it arrived at Elvis's suite a week later. In it, she confessed she had been afraid to take the journey, afraid her son would not survive the trip. But she thanked Elvis for insisting, for waiting, for giving Ronnie a memory that carried him through his darkest hours. "You gave him more than music," the letter read. "You gave him strength, and these last days are brighter because of it." Elvis read the words alone, seated by the hotel window, the city's neon glow reflecting off the glass. He folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and slid it into his jacket pocket. For a long while he remained there, staring into the night. Fame had always been a double-edged sword, cheers on one side, loneliness on the other. But this, he realized, was something entirely different. It was proof that his voice could reach beyond the stage lights, beyond the screaming crowds, into the heart of a single, struggling child. Yet that knowledge carried weight. He felt the burden of it pressing on him in the silence after the shows, when the costumes were put away and the music had stopped. Alone in his hotel room, he sometimes placed his hand on the scarf rack, remembering the small hands that had clutched the one he had given away. Colonel Parker continued to argue, warning Elvis that if he opened the door for one child, hundreds more families would come knocking. "You can't save them all, son," Parker said gruffly, his voice heavy with business-like finality. Elvis didn't answer. Inwardly, he knew the colonel was right. He couldn't save them all. But he also knew that one boy's dream had been worth more than every curtain call, every encore, every cheer that rattled the rafters. Late at night, when the hotel halls were quiet, Elvis sat by himself in the dim glow of a lamp, strumming his guitar without amplification. His voice, softer than the whisper of strings, carried words only he and God could hear. For the first time in a long while, he didn't sing for fame, or for the charts, or even for the audience waiting at the next city. He sang for Ronnie. And though the newspapers would soon chase the next scandal, and Parker would push the next tour, and the crowds would demand their familiar spectacle, Elvis felt a shift within himself that no manager, no critic, and no stage could erase. He had glimpsed the fragile edge of life through the eyes of a child, and it had left him changed. The idea began quietly, almost like a whisper in Elvis's mind that would not fade. The concert had passed, the headlines had come and gone, and still he could not shake the memory of Ronnie's fragile smile beneath the mask. Most entertainers would have let that night remain what it was, a touching moment, preserved in memory and newspaper ink. But Elvis was restless. A promise had taken root inside him, and he knew words alone were not enough. One evening, after rehearsal, he set his guitar aside and told a trusted member of his inner circle, "I'm going to see that boy. Not on stage, not in front of anyone, just me and him." The room fell silent. They all understood the risk. Elvis Presley could barely step outside without being mobbed. A hospital visit, if discovered, would draw a storm of press and adoring fans. Colonel Parker would be furious, but Elvis's decision was firm. Plans were made in secret. No entourage, no announcement. Just Elvis, a driver, and one bodyguard he trusted to keep the visit quiet. He insisted on wearing plain clothes, a dark jacket, simple trousers, nothing that glittered. He wanted to walk through those hospital doors not as the king of rock and roll, but as a man who remembered being a poor boy from Tupelo, with nothing to offer the world except a dream. It was late at night when they arrived. The hospital corridors were hushed, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The smell of disinfectant clung to the air, mixed with the quiet shuffle of nurses finishing their rounds. Elvis kept his head down, following the nurse who had agreed to let him in. His boots echoed softly on the linoleum floor, sounding almost too loud in the silence. When he stepped into Ronnie's room, the scene struck him harder than any spotlight ever had. The boy lay surrounded by machines, their steady beeps marking time like a fragile clock. His skin was pale, his breaths shallow, but when his eyes fluttered open and recognized the figure standing at his bedside, they lit up with a spark so powerful it seemed to outshine the sterile room. "Mr. Presley." Ronnie's voice was a whisper, strained but filled with awe. Elvis sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, as if afraid his weight might disturb the delicate balance of the moment. He reached for the boy's hand, wrapping it gently in his own. "You call me Elvis, son," he said softly. "I'm just a man, same as anyone else." For over an hour, they talked, not of fame or concerts, but of small, human things. Elvis told Ronnie about growing up in Mississippi, about the one-room house where winter winds crept through the cracks, about the nights when he lay awake wondering if life would ever get easier. He spoke of his mother, Gladys, and the way she used to hum to him when he was sick. "We didn't have much," he admitted, "but we had dreams. And dreams can carry you further than you think." Ronnie listened intently, his thin fingers tightening around Elvis's hand. At one point he whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore. You already sang for me. That means I got everything I wanted." The words pierced Elvis to his core. For all his years of applause, for every gold record that lined his walls, nothing had ever struck him so deeply. He swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady as he answered, "You've given me more tonight than I ever gave you, son." The nurses, standing discreetly at the door, wiped at their eyes. They had seen celebrities on television, but never like this. Not stripped of glamour, not sitting on the edge of a sick child's bed, speaking with humility and tenderness. In that moment, Elvis was not an icon, but a man sharing his heart. As the night wore on, Elvis sang quietly. Just a verse, no microphone, no band. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the small room with warmth. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was truer than any stadium performance. Ronnie closed his eyes, the corners of his mouth curving into the faintest smile, and for a while the pain seemed to fade. When Elvis finally rose to leave, Ronnie's mother gripped his arm. Her eyes shimmered with gratitude and exhaustion. "You'll never know what this means," she whispered. Elvis simply shook his head. "Ma'am," he replied, "I think I do." By morning, word began to leak. A hospital orderly had recognized him despite the plain clothes, and whispers spread faster than wildfire. By noon, local reporters were calling, asking if Elvis Presley had truly visited a dying boy in the children's ward. Colonel Parker erupted when he heard, storming into Elvis's suite with his voice raised. "You'll drown in requests now," he warned. "Every fan with a sick child will demand the same. You can't be everything to everyone." Elvis listened quietly, then rose to his full height, his eyes dark but steady. "Maybe I can't," he said, "but I can be something to one." For Parker, it was a maddening answer. For Elvis, it was the only one that mattered. That night, long after the confrontation had ended, Elvis sat alone with his thoughts. The hospital corridors still lingered in his mind. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of machines, the weight of Ronnie's small hand in his own. He had walked through that door as a man trying to give comfort. He left with a burden and a blessing he could never put down. And deep inside, he knew. The boy had changed him. The tour rolled on as it always did. Another city, another arena, another tide of screaming fans waiting outside hotel lobbies. From the outside, little seemed changed. Elvis stepped into the glare of the stage lights. The white jumpsuits still glittered beneath spotlights, and the familiar crescendos of applause echoed like thunder. Yet inside him, everything was different. In the quiet moments before shows, he no longer saw only the vast crowds he was about to face. He saw Ronnie's face, pale but glowing, his hand clutching the blue scarf as if it were life itself. That boy's gaze followed him into the dressing rooms, into the long rides between cities, into the late hours when the hotel walls pressed too closely in. Elvis had sung for millions, but now he found himself singing for one. News of his hospital visit refused to fade. First it was whispered in local Memphis papers, then picked up by national outlets. Some praised him, calling him a man with a heart as big as his voice. Others sneered, suggesting it was a publicity stunt engineered by Colonel Parker. The irony was not lost on Elvis. The Colonel had tried desperately to bury the story, yet gossip painted it as his invention. It weighed heavily on Elvis. He knew the truth, but the truth often mattered less than the stories people chose to believe. He began to resent the spotlight in a way he never had before. It was one thing to be chased by photographers when leaving a hotel. It was another to see a child's final moments questioned and cheapened as if they were part of some performance. He made a point to tell his inner circle, "This stays sacred." Nobody uses that boy's name for press. Nobody. His voice carried an edge that silenced any argument. Even the Colonel knew when a line could not be crossed. Still, the weight pressed on him. On stage, he began to change. His voice, always powerful, now carried a vulnerability that startled those closest to him. During songs like My Way or Unchained Melody, he no longer belted out every note with bravado. Instead, he let certain lines fall into softness, almost a whisper, as if he were singing to someone who might not make it to the end of the verse. Fans noticed. Women wept openly. Men, hardened and stoic, found themselves blinking back tears. One night in St. Louis, he paused between songs and, almost without realizing it, spoke into the microphone. Sometimes a song is more than music. Sometimes it's the last gift you can give. The words hung in the air. The audience fell silent, unsure what he meant, but they felt the truth of it in their bones. When he launched into the next number, there was not a sound in the hall except his voice. Backstage, band members traded glances. "He's different now," one whispered. "Something's changed in him." They were right. The boy's shadow was stitched into every note. Fan mail began to shift as well. Letters poured in, not just the usual declarations of love or requests for autographs, but drawings from children, prayers from families, stories of illnesses and last wishes. Elvis read them in silence, sometimes alone in his hotel room, with a pile of envelopes spread across the bed. Some he kept tucked into his Bible, their paper wrinkled from his hands. He could not answer them all. No one could. But he read every one that was placed before him. Colonel Parker grew more frustrated. "You can't save the world, son," he warned again. "You're one man. You'll drown in this." Elvis only shook his head. "If a song can give someone hope, then it's not wasted," he replied. Parker sighed, realizing there was no changing him. The weight was invisible, but those who knew him best saw it. After shows, instead of basking in the adoration, Elvis often retreated into his dressing room, still in costume, staring at the floor as though the applause outside were miles away. He would take out the letter Ronnie's mother had written and read it again, mouthing the words as though they were a prayer. In one city, a stagehand found him sitting alone with his guitar long after the crowd had gone. Elvis strummed softly, his voice low, not performing, not rehearsing, just speaking through music to someone who could no longer answer back. The stagehand slipped away quietly, understanding that this was not a moment for witnesses. The fans sensed the change too. Something in his presence had deepened, as though fame's veneer had cracked, allowing something raw and human to shine through. When he sang, they no longer heard only the king of rock and roll. They heard a man carrying the invisible weight of someone else's story. For Elvis, the concerts had become a strange paradox. They drained him more than ever, yet they also gave him a way to keep his promise. Every night, when he closed his eyes to sing, he pictured Ronnie in the front row. And in those moments, the spotlight narrowed until the crowd disappeared, and it was once again just him and the boy. He could not stop the rumors. He could not stop the sickness that clung to children like Ronnie. He could not fight the tide of demands, of questions, of cynicism. But he could sing. And in that singing, he gave pieces of himself he had never shared before. In the end, it was not the spectacle that defined those shows. It was the quiet moments, his gaze lifted to the ceiling as though he were looking beyond the rafters, the softness of his voice on a single line, the unspoken knowledge that the king was carrying something far heavier than the weight of his crown. And though few in the audience knew the full story, they felt it. Night after night, they left the arenas changed, whispering to each other that Elvis was different now. They were right. He was singing with a burden that could not be measured in ticket sales or applause. The boy was still with him. The call came quietly, on an ordinary afternoon. Elvis was in his hotel suite between shows, sitting at a small table strewn with unopened fan letters and half-finished coffee, when a member of his staff, stepped hesitantly into the room. The man's expression gave the truth away before he spoke. Elvis set down his pen slowly, bracing for words he already felt in his chest. "It's Ronnie," the staffer said softly. "He passed last night, in his sleep. His mother wanted you to know. He was holding the scarf you gave him." The room seemed to tilt. Elvis stared at the table, his fingers curling against the wood as though steadying himself. No crowd, no cameras, no band could have prepared him for the silence that followed those words. He nodded once, unable to speak, and dismissed the man with a quiet gesture. When the door closed, Elvis rose and crossed the room with unsteady steps. He shut himself in the bedroom, drew the curtains, and stayed there for hours. No music, no television, only silence. His aides, waiting outside, said they could hear nothing at all. It was as if the king of rock and roll had vanished into the shadows, leaving only a man weighed down by grief. That evening, he emerged, his face pale but resolved. "Tonight," he told his band simply, "I'm singing for him." There was no further explanation. They didn't need one. The arena that night was packed as always. Fans waved signs, shouted his name, surged forward when the lights dimmed. But Elvis walked onto the stage with a solemnity that silenced the hall before he even opened his mouth. He did not flash his famous smile. He did not deliver the playful banter they expected. He stepped to the microphone, gripped it tightly, and stood still for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying steady but subdued. "I want to dedicate this show to a young friend of mine. His name was Ronnie Twilly. Some of you may have read about him. He's not with us anymore. But tonight, every note I sing is for him." A hush swept the crowd. Thousands of people sat frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Elvis signaled the band, and the opening chords began, not with the usual thunder, but with a quiet reverence. He sang as if he were alone, pouring every ounce of himself into the melody. His voice, raw and trembling at times, reached places it never had before. The audience leaned forward, as though afraid to miss a single breath. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. Men bowed their heads. The music seemed to rise from something deeper than performance, deeper than fame. It was grief transfigured into sound. As the final verse ended, Elvis did something he had never done before. He lowered the microphone, let the last note hang in the air, and then stepped back from the spotlight. He did not bow. He did not say the familiar words, "Thank you very much." He simply stood in silence, his eyes cast upward, as if offering the song to someone beyond the rafters. The crowd remained still. No one clapped at first. The usual explosion of applause never came. Instead, the arena was filled with a heavy, sacred quiet, as though 20,000 people had all agreed, without a word, to honor that silence. Some wept openly, others closed their eyes, but not a single seat shifted until Elvis turned and walked slowly off the stage. Back in the wings, his band sat stunned. They had played with him for years, through triumphs and disasters, but never had they witnessed anything like this. Elvis removed his ring-studded hands from the microphone stand, wiped his forehead with a plain towel, and disappeared down the corridor without a glance back. His usual entourage did not follow. He needed to be alone. In the dressing room, he sat heavily in a chair, still in costume, and closed his eyes. The images replayed in his mind. Ronnie in the front row, smiling through the mask. Ronnie in the hospital bed, whispering he wasn't afraid anymore. The letter from his mother, thanking him for days that had seemed impossible. The ache in his chest was sharp, but it carried something else, too. An odd sense of peace, knowing he had kept his promise until the very end. The newspapers covered the concert the next morning with reverence. Headlines read, "Elvis dedicates show to dying boy. Silence falls on the King's stage." Reporters described the stillness in the hall, the way no one dared to break it until long after Elvis had gone. But even their words fell short. The truth of that night could not be captured in ink. It lived only in the hearts of those who had been there, in the memory of a silence more powerful than any ovation. For Elvis, it became a turning point. He would continue to tour, to sing, to dazzle crowds. But deep inside, he carried Ronnie's memory as a compass. In every quiet song, in every tender lyric, there was an echo of the boy who had taught him that music could be more than entertainment, that it could be a final gift, a bridge between life and death. And so, though history remembers him as the king of rock and roll, those who knew this story understood something more. On that night, in the stillness of a hushed arena, Elvis Presley was not a legend, not an untouchable figure draped in rhinestones. He was a man who had given his voice to fulfill a child's last dream. Perhaps, in all the years of triumph and spectacle, it was his greatest performance, not because of the song itself, but because it was sung with nothing but love.